So let's start by talking about the objectives and the modeling components of explicit instruction. So we're going to look at identifying clear objectives and modeling in lessons. We're going to evaluate whether or not the objectives and modeling are in fact effective, and we're going to reflect on our own use of, you're going to reflect upon your own use of objectives and modeling in your own practice. For explicit instruction, for the first two parts of objectives and modeling, here are the checklists. We'll return to these a little bit later, so I'm not going to talk about each of the elements now. The first lesson you're going to watch is from a 6th grade co-taught English language arts class. The students are reading a text concerning Ellis Island. It's on a unit the teachers are doing on immigration. They've just read a text called Travels with Charlie, written by John Steinbeck, that's about John Steinbeck and his dog going across the US. There's a funny little story about immigration in it, embedded within it. And the general purpose of the lesson is to activate students' background knowledge related to this text on Ellis Island. True confessions, yes, if you were sort of wondering what's behind me, yeah, that's me doing this lesson. So this is actually a demonstration lesson I did in a 6th grade English language art class in Rhode Island in the Bristol-Warren Regional School District. And this lesson was in Ms. Skagos and Ms. Crandall's class. So I want to acknowledge them for the opportunity to actually teach this lesson. So in the lesson that I deliver, you're going to look at the lesson and think about what's the objective I actually had. We're not going to give it to you in advance. We want you to think about what was the objective. And then look at the cases where you saw modeling. You're going to use timestamps here to estimate about when in the lesson did you find, for example, the modeling. So let's watch the video of me teaching this lesson. Then we'll have an opportunity to come back and reflect on whether or not I did a good job of having a clear objective and whether or not my modeling matched the objective well. So let's watch me do this now. So you're going to read a text with Ms. Crandall and Ms. Skagos later. And my job this morning is to tell you a little bit about it to get you ready to read it. Okay? So here are the things I want to talk to you about. It's a little hard to see, but so this says Ellis Island. What does it say? One more time. What does it say?
Ellis Island.
Ellis Island. So have you heard of Ellis Island before? Okay. So Ellis Island is a place in the United States where a lot of times people would come when they came to this country for the first time. And they had to cross the border. How many of you remember reading Travels with Charlie, and there was something about a border? Anyone remember something about a border in Travels with Charlie? Almost everybody knows something about a border. So why don't you talk at the table for just a second, see if you can remind the people at your table what happened at the border. Go ahead and talk about it.
The Canadian border wouldn't let Charlie into, well, John and Charlie into Canada because the dog didn't have the right papers and stuff.
And so it was like really complicated, right? Because he didn't really leave, but then he wouldn't come back. He couldn't come back in, right? Yeah. So crossing the border, kind of hard sometimes, right? Okay. Would you mind sharing that with everybody? Okay. All right. That was quick, but that's all we're going to do for now. So what's your name? Matthew, will you tell everybody what did you tell us about what happened at the border?
Well, John and Charlie went to the Canadian border, but they wouldn't let Charlie and John go through because Charlie didn't have the right registration and papers.
Yeah. So when you cross the border into another country, you often have to have some special documents. And a long time ago, people would come to the United States and they would go to Ellis Island. Where would they go? Ellis Island. I'm going to show you a little bit about Ellis Island so you can kind of get a picture of what Ellis Island is like. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a YouTube video that describes a little bit, shows a little bit about Ellis Island. I'm going to watch just a little section of it. There's this little boy here who's coming there for the first time. You can see all these people have to go through these lines and all kinds of things going on. This is the place they would come to the United States for the very first time. And they had to, this is like crossing the border, kind of like they had to do with Charlie and how it can be complicated sometimes. See, they're checking the boy to see if his health is okay, being really careful to make sure that everything is safe. So lots of documents, like Matthew was saying before, right? Like you had to have all these papers for Charlie. When people come to the US for the first time, they have to have all kinds of documents. When people came to the United States at Ellis Island, something would happen to people's names, okay? So I'm going to show you a little bit of this clip, a little more of this clip in a second. I want you to listen really carefully to what happens. The boy in the movie, this is from a movie. The boy in the movie, his last name is Andolini, Okay, what's his last name? Andolini. I want you to hear what happens to his last name in the little bit that I'm going to show you. So he goes up to the desk, and they ask him his name, and I want you to see what happens to his name. See if you can figure it out when we watch the clip. So listen carefully. So we're about to see it, okay? So there's a little boy going up to the desk. He's going to tell them his name. Watch what happens.
What is your name? Come on, son. What is your name?
Okay, so he said, my name is Vito Corleone, and the man said he's Vito Corleone from Vito Andolini from Corleone, Sicily. What did they do to his name? What did the man write down? Yeah, what did he write down? They changed his name. So it used to be Andolini, and they changed it to Corleone. Right there, and they wrote it down. And after that, in the movie, that's the boy's name the whole movie. And that happened to a lot of people's families at Ellis Island. They would go to Ellis Island with one name, and then someone would write it the wrong way, or they'd change it, and all of a sudden they had a new name. And the story you're going to read with Ms. Gagos, Ms. Crandall, that's what happens to the girl's family. And she goes to Ellis Island to find out about it when she's many years later, and that happened to her grandfather. So that's the one thing I wanted you to know about the story before we read it. We learned something important about what happened when people came to the United States. What was the place that they went when they arrived? Everybody? They would go to Ellis Island. I want you to think for a second, what was the important thing that would happen to people's families when they got there? Think about the video. Tell the people at your table. What happened when the people went to different countries? What happened?
Their names would be changed, like they would be like misheard, or they would be like written down wrong.
Yeah, and sometimes people do it on purpose. They'd be like, no, I don't want to give you that name. Yeah, and so you want to tell us that? What was your name? Sam? All right, Sam, tell us what would happen. Yeah, and so I mentioned that to Sam, that sometimes it was a mistake, like in the video, right? But sometimes they would actually do it on purpose. They'd be like, no, I want to give you, sometimes they give them like a more American name, and that's actually what's going to be in the story. So when you get to read this, you'll get to find out this girl's name is Emily Dalton, and you're going to get to find out what her name used to be. Now I'm going to go on this side. So let's talk about this. So here are the objectives that I came up with based on the video and based on my original plan for this. So my objectives were to identify the purpose and key characteristics of Ellis Island and to explain how families' names could be changed when they came to Ellis Island. So let's evaluate that in terms of my checklist here. So first, I need to decide whether or not I selected a goal from IEP standards. So if we think about this, thinking back to what I did, I know that this is related to the teacher's unit on immigration. So I did not actually make a decision about the actual standard, but the teachers told me that this was related to their standards and would prepare them to read the text that was standards related. So I'm going to say that that is appropriate for this class, which was a co-taught class where about a third of the students had IEPs. Teachers also said that this was relevant for the students' IEPs. So we're good there. All right, now let's look at the second one, which is whether or not the objective is the next step toward the goal. Well, this is a little bit tricky. Now, they're just at the beginning of the text, so it's appropriate to be learning about Ellis Island to frame that for the students. And it relates back to the students' experience with travels with Charlie. So in terms of preparing them to read the text and understand these concepts about Ellis Island, I think we've got a good next step there. So I'm going to give myself credit for that one. Let's look at whether or not the objective is limited to one singular next step toward the goal. Well, it's pretty clear it is not singular. It just isn't. Right? I try to teach two separate things as I put on my objective. So that does not meet that criterion. And finally, in terms of describing learning outcome in behavioral terms that assesses mastery of the objective, I didn't do that. So I didn't specify in my objective how students would demonstrate mastery. In the video, I actually didn't have a clear learning outcome that shows mastery. I had the students chat with each other about what they thought was happening, but I don't think that the students had a clear enough opportunity to each of them demonstrate that they actually understood the concept. So that, in my mind, is a big miss for me, that I didn't have a clearly enough stated outcome. I could have done it more clearly, and if I had, then I would have given myself the check, but I didn't. So a better objective might be to say that students will explain the way in which immigrant families' names were sometimes changed to Ellis Island by explaining this to a partner, which is in some ways what they did, but I think that if I'd had a clear objective, I would have probably on one more step and had students practice that once more independently, to show me that they had actually mastered the objective. Okay, so that's my view of those things. So I could have done better, and if I'd done the things I just described like this, then I could have given myself 2 check marks. But I didn't, so that's okay. I'm reflecting on my practice just like we want you to do. Now I have to think about, where did these things occur in the lesson? So I've got some timestamps here for you. There they are. You may have the same ones, you may not. We're going to have an opportunity to talk about that together, and so let's go ahead and do that now. Here you have to ask yourself, is this procedural knowledge, is there a process, or is this declarative knowledge where you want students to remember actual discrete elements of information? And what should be clear to you is that here we're focusing on the declarative part of the instruction. So we're focusing on these things. We want to think about whether or not I meet the criteria in these terms. So you can look at these to remind yourself what kind of things you ought to see. So let's talk about what that should look like. So in terms of the clear explanation, the idea was to give students an introduction to this text, but I had this key idea that I wanted to represent about, well, I can't even say it now, about what happened to families' names at Ellis Island. What I didn't have was a specific explanation that I could use repeatedly to describe this, this concept, right? That families' names were sometimes changed at Ellis Island. And so because I didn't have that clear explanation, I kind of said it in different ways, and then the students would say it in different ways, and that's because I didn't make a super clear explanation. The concept was relatively clear, I just didn't have that clear language. So I'm giving myself sort of a circly, maybe sort of thing. So it's not all the way there. Okay, now this one's interesting. Modeling multiple plan examples. So did I do it? I'm giving myself a big old maybe circle here. Now, in truth, I didn't actually ever model. I gave that one example where the boy goes up to the desk and the name is Vito Annalini, gets changed to Vito Corleone. And that is technically practice because I didn't give the answer. I asked students to tell me the answer. But it is so highly scaffolded that I think, in fact, it serves as a kind of model. So really, is that a model? Yeah, I think we can argue that it is because of the level of scaffolding that I provide. So that's maybe true, but what's not true is that it's more than one model. The question here then is, like, do I need more than one model? You could say potentially no, because when I asked students to do it in the next phase, they did seem to have a pretty good idea about what to do. So you could say that I only modeled once, and maybe 0 times, but I'm going to go with once. And I certainly didn't model more than once, but we could also say maybe that was appropriate. So I think it's somewhere in the middle, and that's why I'm kind of giving a circle here, is because I'm not 100% sure it was the most effective way to do it. I don't think it was terrible either, which is why I'm not giving it an X. So finally, let's talk about my use of supporting practices. I think you can agree here that I use supporting practices throughout. I have very frequent responses and provide immediate feedback to students as they go through. I check in on the partner discussions, and I have some group discussion that I think facilitated the lesson. So I think that I definitely did that. So here's a summary of all the things that I did. And you can see here that although I tried to construct a very strong lesson that followed the principles of explicit instruction, I didn't master all of those things. Partly because when I thought about the lesson, I wanted to introduce students to concepts. That said, you have to think to yourself, well, is that the right thing to do if you're trying to do an explicit lesson? And in that case, I really was trying to be explicit about this concept about families' names being changed at Ellis Island. And if that was my goal, I could have done that better with a more clear objective and with better modeling. So now that you've seen me reflect on my own practice, let's reflect on someone else's practice. And this is where I want you to get more involved in this process and start to think about it together. So your task now is going to be evaluate a lesson. I'm going to tell you what I think as well, but your task is to evaluate the lesson. In this case, the students are going to be reading a text named Backpacks Mean Backaches, and they're going to fill out a graphic organizer. It's related to identifying causes and effects using keywords in texts. and they already know the meaning of cause and effect, and they already know clue words related to cause and effect. So the general purpose, again, is to identify causes and effects. Just like you did with my video, you're going to be looking for evidence of modeling using your timestamps. You're also going to figure out what you think the objective is in the lesson, and the teacher does sort of present that right at the beginning. Let's go ahead and watch the teacher's lesson, and then we'll reflect together on whether or not this was a good example of all the parts of the checklist. You might want to have that checklist with you as you watch so you can start to think about it yourself. So let's go ahead and watch.
Find a cause or an effect. And whenever we find a cause, we're going to mark it blue. And whenever we find an effect, we're going to mark it green, just to help us analyze. So here's an example. After I read it, I want you to look for the clue words. See if you can find one. Cats take many naps because they have lots of energy and play for a long time. Put your thumb up if you can see one of those clue words. Okay, shout it out.
Because.
You did. You found because. I'm going to circle it in blue. Now, that should help you figure out which is the cause and effect in this sentence. Do you guys agree that because they have lots of energy and play for a long time is the cause? Yeah, and that clue word, did it help you find it? Yeah. Now, this is tricky because the cause doesn't always go at the beginning of a sentence, does it? All right, so Lorenzo, thank you. Who found the effect?
Cats take naps.
Cats take many naps. Does that make sense to you all? But that's the effect. All right, you guys did a great.
Okay, so now let's talk about the objective. The objective here is the stated objective, the one that the teacher actually gives. Students can use clue words to help find and understand cause and effect while reading. So let's think about whether or not that matches our criteria. First, is it selected from an IEP or standards? Well, I can tell you that in the Common Core standards for third grade, here they are. Third grade standard is that you can, this is blurry, so I have typed it out for you. Students will describe the logical connection between particular sentences and paragraphs and texts, including understanding causes and effects. So we can say then that that would be an example of that. Now, some states don't have Common Core. This is the state of Virginia, for example. In the state of Virginia, if you look at the fourth grade standards, they have this part about identifying cause and effect relationships. So even though in third grade Common Core cases that would be appropriate, if you were in a state like Virginia, then it might be more appropriate for that. So if this is a Common Core state, which this is, then it's fully appropriate for the teacher to be doing this lesson on cause and effect. If we're in Virginia, maybe it would be better to do with fourth grade. In terms of student instructional level here, we don't know about the student's IEP objectives. We don't know about whether or not this group includes a wide range of levels. But we're going to make the assumption that it matches the student's instructional level and is thus appropriate for this group of students. So we can give that a check. So now let's look at whether or not it's the next step toward the goal the teacher has of helping students understand this IEP objective of identifying these logical connections with cause and effect. So if we look at the teacher's lesson here, the teacher's objective is a good next step toward the goal because the students have already learned the words about cause and effect, and they know the clue words that we pointed out to you before, and now they're going to identify it with examples. So this is a good way to check for their understanding of the original ideas and to move on to the next concept. So we can give credit for that. So now let's talk about whether or not this is a focus objective. Is it limited to one singular next step? It definitely is not. So the objective is, well, let me say it this way. It probably is, but the part that was written actually has three parts to it. So in the written objective, first, there's using clue words. Second, there's finding cause and effect. And third, there's understanding cause and effect. Now, students should be able to already understand cause and effect because they already did that. And the first two parts, using the clue words and finding the cause and effects, should probably be combined because this includes, the lesson is about finding the cause and effects and clue words and categorizing them. But it could also arguably be two separate things, using clue words and finding cause and effects. But certainly, even though it's tricky, it's definitely not one objective. It's at least two, the first and the second together, and the third separately, which was something the students already knew. And even the first two maybe could be parsed out. So it's not totally wrong. I'm going to give it a circle because I'm not sure it's all the way there. So is the learning outcome then defined in terms of, in behavioral terms that assesses mastery of the objective? So the objective is that students will use clue words, but it's not clear what the teacher means by using them. And that comes across in the lesson is the teacher isn't being really clear about how she expects students to do that. From the beginning, I can tell this lesson is going to be a little bit murky in terms of the way students sort of learn the content because teacher isn't explicit about how the students will show that they're using them. And it also doesn't explain in the objective what it means to understand them. How do the students show understanding? We can't see inside their heads, so how do we actually know they understand? And as I already said, they should actually understand what cause and effects are, so I'm not sure why they're doing that anyway. So that part is probably extraneous. So we definitely don't have a clear understanding of how the teacher will assess whether or not the students actually understand this idea in the lesson of identifying the causes and effects using the clue words and sentences. So that definitely doesn't meet that criterion. So we have to give that one an X. So if we took this lesson apart and we rewrote the objectives, here's a way we could do that. So if we took those first two and put them together, we could say, student will be able to categorize sentence components as cause and effects using clue words like because and since. So now we're combining those two things, but that's one single thing students are doing. And then the second thing would be students will locate cause and effect statements in text using clue words. So we're categorizing components like causes and effects using the clue words, and then we're locating them separately. And probably we're doing locating before categorizing, but those are now two separate objectives. And so if we'd written them that way, we could probably turn those into check marks. So now that you have a chance to evaluate that lesson, let's show you the timestamps that we came up with. In this case, there aren't so many. Here are the times we thought that there might be a clear explanation, a planned example, but we're not sure. We'll talk further about that as we go forward. So let's talk about it now. So in terms of modeling, the first thing is giving clear explanations. We're going to have to give this an X, I think, and here's why. The goal of giving a clear explanation is to give an explanation that describes clearly what the students will use. The teacher talks about using the blue mark for the cause and the green mark for the green. But she doesn't explain how the students are going to do this when they do it on their own. She does not say circle the cause in blue or that she's doing that. She does not list finding the clue words as an initial step. So there aren't clear steps for the students to follow. So remember that modeling is about making your thinking transparent, and she isn't doing it in this case. Doesn't mean she's doing a bad job. Remember, we're going to critique everyone's lessons, whether or not they're good or bad. In fact, we're not going to identify whether or not they're good or bad. We're just going to say whether or not it met the criteria. In this case, this lesson doesn't meet that criterion because it isn't clear what the explanation is. The teacher doesn't use it consistently, and it isn't sort of a single thing the teacher can repeat. The steps are never made clear to the students. So in terms of modeling, there's a lot to think about here. The teacher gives one example sentence on the board, and this is all the modeling in the video. She tells students to find the clue words, but she doesn't actually find the clue words herself. A model, remember, would be her saying something like, I'm going to look for my clue words in this sentence. One clue word I see is this. It doesn't have to take a long time. She might be worried, I'm going to waste the students' time by not letting them do it. The whole point of a model is to show students how to do it without them being forced to be involved, because then they can actually see your whole process thought out. She doesn't lead the students step by step. She says, I'm going to circle the clue word in blue, but that's the only one she verbalizes. The rest of it, she actually just kind of does or never sort of clearly explains what she's going to do. And she doesn't verbalize her thinking. They've already said that's really important to do and helpful to do in one sort of fell swoop, one big block of her thinking, but she never does that either. We don't get to see how the cause was actually identified. She says what it is, she underlines it, she doesn't explain why that's actually the cause. So they provide the answer, but they don't get the opportunity, in that case, but they don't get the opportunity to sit back and observe what's going on. So as a result, it's not actually really clearly a complete example. That's a good example of a case where there isn't a clear example. And I think that I like that example of this because I often see these kinds of lessons where the teachers involve students in the lesson in a way that results in it actually not being a model. It becomes a sort of hybrid between the student and the teacher, where the teacher isn't able to give a clear linear description of the process because they involve the students in a way that makes students do some of the intellectual work. It's great to have students involved, but you want to do it in a limited way, using some of those lower level ways of thinking, like using sort of like choral response that we talked about, which is really only good for remembering. That's appropriate in this case because it doesn't force the students to do the cognitive work, and it keeps the focus on completing the model. So that's a really key piece here. Now, how about those supporting practices? Did we see evidence of those in the video? Hopefully you've had a chance to think about that yourself. Let me tell you what I think. Well, I'm going to say here that we didn't see a lot of use of supporting practices. It's true that the teacher attempted to elicit responses from the students, and that's great. The problem is that students are not actually responding, and the teacher ends up having to answer her own questions or occasionally have just one student respond. And as we've talked about in terms of the ways you elicit responses, we need to find ways to get all students participating as often as possible. This didn't end up doing it. Second, in terms of providing immediate feedback, the teacher did provide the answers, but she doesn't provide an explanation, therefore limiting the amount of effective feedback the students receive. So overall, I think we have to say that we didn't see a lot of use of the supporting practices. Before I go on, I just want to be clear that this doesn't mean that the teacher didn't do a good job or didn't try hard. As you know, the whole point of this exercise is to say, what did we see relative to the checklist? And if we don't see it, we don't see it, and that's all right. And we didn't see it in this case, and we're going to go ahead and, if I were that teacher, talk about how can I build that information into my lessons next time. So remember, we're not judging. We're using the checklist and comparing practice to the items on it. If they're there, great. If not, we'll work on it. There was a good attempt in terms of the objective, although we still saw a lack of clarity. And that lack of clarity really comes out in the model. So this is a good example of how when your lesson objective is not precise in terms of what you expect students to actually do when they master the objective, it plays out in the modeling because then the modeling becomes a little bit muddled as well, where it's not clear what the students are expected to do because the teacher never shows the students what to do. So if I were a student in this class and I were asked to do this after, I'm not sure I would know how to complete whatever task was given because I've not seen the entire task modeled. Presumably the teacher wants the students to go through, circle cause and effect words, and put the cause and effect in the right boxes, but she never went through that entire process herself using Think Alouds to model the process, okay? So as a result, it doesn't meet our criteria. And why did we have this kind of a model? It goes back to having an objective that wasn't sufficiently clear. I believe that if this teacher had been able to think more carefully about the objective, not that she wasn't careful, but had been able to think of an objective that meet these criteria, because maybe she's never seen these before, then it would have resulted in clearer modeling. But it didn't happen here. So to wrap up this first part, the key points here are to craft objectives carefully and to provide good explanations and well-aligned examples, and finally to self-reflect. And we'll talk more about that in a second. You already have your checklist for objectives and your checklist for modeling. And so I'm not going to say more about those. We've just talked about them and how they're related. Finally, I want to talk, though, about self-reflecting. Self-reflection is really critical, and it's critical here in the green phase, the action phase, because now you're going to be taking this and reflecting on your own practice. So as we move into asking you to do this on your own, I want to highlight a couple of points for you. One is that you should not expect that you're going to be perfect at writing the objectives and planning good modeling the first time you do it. If there's something that you haven't thought, either you've never done before because you're a new teacher, raise your hand if you're a new teacher, or if there's something you haven't thought about in a long time because you're a veteran teacher, raise your hand if you're a veteran teacher. I'll count myself on that one. And so as a result, like if you haven't thought about it in a while, you might not be as confident with it. And I will tell you that you shouldn't expect to be perfect because I'm the one teaching this, and I did not do a perfect job in a lesson that I designed. So that's not a great example, but it's okay because all I need to do is reflect on my practice. I wrote that self-reflection myself. Why did I do it the way I did? Because I looked at my practice related to the checklist, and I saw it wasn't quite there. And you know what? It's okay because it's not about being good. It's not about being bad. It's about whether or not I met the criteria. So when you plan, you want to just try your best. Do as well as you can at the moment in your development. But to make that go well, the key thing you can do is use your checklist to guide you. And as you do this, set goals for what you're going to do well. Think about, as we talked about before in the DBI framework, think about what what might be the biggest hang up for students in terms of them not being successful. So you can set a goal about, I want to make sure I do X, because that's going to contribute to the best learning for students. For example, I know my objectives are often not clear, and that results in students not knowing what to do and me not doing good modeling. So my goal is to improve the way I write my objectives. So plan with a focus on the thing that you want to do better and see if you reach your goal of doing that better. Once you've taught your lessons, when you reflect, go back to that checklist again, because it's not about being good or bad. So if you say, did I follow the checklist? That's good. Well, okay, get rid of the word good there. So what I mean is, if you follow the checklist, you're doing the right thing. But if you say to yourself, was that lesson good? You don't want to do that. That's not good. This is confusing. Did I follow the checklist? It's a good thing to follow to ask yourself the question, I follow the checklist. Asking yourself whether or not you did a good lesson, that's not a good thing to do because it involves a judgment about your practice that we don't want you to have. I don't want you to have because it's going to make you feel a lack of confidence because you didn't do it right. There's no doing it wrong, there's no doing it badly, there's whether or not you met the criteria on the checklist, and that's going to help you be more objective about your own practice. And don't forget, there's always room to grow. I've been doing this for a while, I know a lot about this stuff, and I still have lots of room to grow. So it's okay. And that gets us ready to finish out this module by preparing a lesson and trying it out. So just as you've done before, you're going to think about a lesson you're going to teach soon, write a clear objective, prepare a good model following these criteria, and then try it out. Review the objective after you tried out your lesson. Review the objective, review your clear explanation that you've written out, and use it as you've taught it. Adjust the plan to keep it less than 10 minutes so you can focus just on this piece. And then do the lesson by videotaping it, working from the plan you've written, and then focusing on the modeling and explanation. Try to limit it to 10 minutes so you can focus on this part alone. When you're done, you want to self-reflect. Watch the video. Use the timestamps to record evidence of when your objective becomes clear to the students and when you do the modeling. Describe what you see for yourself in terms of jotting your notes. And then evaluate whether or not, relative to the checklist, it meets the criteria. And then you want to meet with someone to self-reflect, whether that's an instructor, a coach, or a peer. So there you go. Those are all the pieces of trying to understand whether or not your modeling and practice meet those criteria. So now, move on to the next one.